French, French.
So, first question. This comes down to a very simple thing. The business metaphor, the money metaphor, they don't align with each other. They don't appear to be related to each other. Is that a problem? What do we do about it? If that's one of our clients, what do we do with that information? Now, this, unfortunately, is actually a big question that will require a far bigger answer than I can give in this little video. So it's something I'll probably work on a little bit and come back again with some additional info. Now, they don't need to align. We have to bear in mind that when we're eliciting the metaphor from people, we don't know whether they're giving you experiential metaphor, what's it like for me, or essentially what is money like in the monetary system, or what is money like generically for other people. We don't necessarily know whether the business metaphor is going to be a personal thing. So I experience my business to be, but my business is structured as. So what we experience and what we actually do when it comes to metaphors of business and money may not be the same as the experiential metaphors that we're exploring in levels 1, 2, and 3. In those levels, we're working with experiential metaphors. So the person may come up with idiomatic communication about the metaphor. When we elicit what it's like for them, they may deviate dramatically from what they originally said on the surface idioms. And that their experience is far weirder and more complicated than they would normally talk about. When it comes to business metaphors, often the person's never really thought about it before. They may well go into this. How I feel about my business is not necessarily going to be what the business is. So are they giving you how they feel about it, the consequences upon them, for example, or are they giving you examples of the business, what that's like? Do you remember those things we cover on day 1 in level 1, that what I call the left brain communication, for want of a better term? They may be giving you experiential or metaphorical representations of those experiences, which may or may not be actual representations of the business. I'm hoping this makes sense. Now, for the money part, again, we have the same set of filters going on. There's lots of variables of what they could be answering. And how I run business and how I do money may not necessarily be aligned with each other whatsoever. My observation is this, that some people are very money orientated in business, and their whole business is designed around the acquisition of money. So they view the customer, the people that they are servicing with their product, whatever that product is, they see them as a source of income. And their job is basically to get that person over there to part with their cash in exchange for whatever it is we offer them, and then hopefully keep them happy with that or get out of town fast. And that's largely, so the business is built around the extraction of money from other people. And you'll see that a lot with internet marketers and information-based products. There's other businesses are largely, I've built my business, I'm an artist, I'm a creator, I'm a builder, I do things, I create things that weren't there before, and now they are here using my skill set. And then I work out the mechanism by which to sell that. So the image of the struggling artist who's never quite managed to marry those two things together is a classic representation of where this can go wrong. Because their business isn't designed around the extraction of cash from another human being. Their business is designed around the creation of what it is they create. And then hopefully other people will want that. So there's integrity based more towards one quality of the product, and the other one is there's a lot more success orientated towards the first scenario that I was talking about. And there's a fine line really, or fine balance, whatever one we want to go for, between the integrity of the product and the success of the product. For example, in the music industry, you will see two typical scenarios. There is the producers who often work in a team in conjunction with a whole load of other people. They are paying attention to what is it the kids are buying, what are they requesting, what is popular, what do they want. They then put together their artists, their performers, they write the script for them, the musical script, they produce the product. but the product is shaped around what is currently popular, and basically produce it fast, get it out there before the fashion changes. And that is your classic throwaway pop. Stop Aitken and Waterman back in whenever it was. They were superb at producing that. And for a while, that brand of music they were creating itself then took on its own particular genre. So their business model was very much give people what they want in exchange for the cash they give you, which is what you want. But your artists who are regarded as being more authentic, more genuine, more higher integrity, generally it's not about the sales, it's about the quality of the experience they're creating, largely for themselves, but also the integrity they have to their product. So you have a lot of artists who, by definition, will shun success. And I have a particular artist I won't name because I think it would be unfair to do so. Was a very small gig-playing artist who had recorded one album. And I personally think of this album as being one of the best I've ever heard. Lyrically, musically, performance-wise, superb. Now that record got the person the commercial deal. So this individual went from being independent label, self-produced, to being mainstream artist. And it killed the quality of the music. So the second album out now has been tailored and adjusted and sanitized to fit the mass sell. And that ended any hope of this person's future. And they're tied into contracts now with that record company, and so can't now take control back of their own integrity and values. Bit of a deviation there, so I'm sorry. But essentially, the money metaphors don't have to match. Because the other one is, I may well be the person who constructs the business, I build the business, so I have the classic construction metaphor, but for me, money is always liquid. And how does the building function relative to money and money relative to the building? It doesn't. The activities within the building are the very things that generate the revenue. So whilst we may use construction metaphors to talk about building the business, blah, 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 that doesn't necessarily mean that's the function of the business. It gives away some of the key qualities, of course. So also, I may not be the person who's then got the marketing funnel, handling the cash and everything else. I've got employees to do that, or finance departments to do that, or a sales team, or a marketing team. I might have a research and development team, and so forth, all of those things. So the alignment doesn't have to be there. Now, it can be very, very helpful if the money metaphor the person has kind of matches that of everybody else. It's all very well and good if you're a creator living in your own little universe, spinning around your own orbit, completely disconnected from everyone else. And some of the most creative people tend to be slightly out there in terms of how well they are connecting with the mindset of everybody else. But when it comes to being commercially successful, because of the way money operates, it's the agreement between people, it probably is very, very useful to at least understand other people's common representation for money, and also other people's common representations for business. A lot of people, though, never get that far because money has all the negative connotations, especially in the Judeo-Christian West, where it's like the root of all evil, the complete misquote that people like to use. My experience out in Asia, for example, people don't have the taboo in discussing or handling or arguing about money. It is a perfectly normal thing to be given your change and people to count it and they go, that's not correct, and have an argument about it, and no one feels awkward. It's just a normal fact of life. But in the West, we tend to be a little bit more either emotional or inhibited about it. So there might well be sort of those lurking idiomatic influences, metaphorical influences going back to biblical eras where we're stuck with limitations on this. So it's worth actually paying attention to what money metaphors are, what is shared by other people, and how they work. If you're working with somebody and there is a differential between the money metaphor and the business metaphor, then it is something you want to discuss with the person. Actually say, okay, have you thought about these things? Is this something that we need to develop and work on? But it's not necessarily our outcome to make them align with each other. So now the next question is, what if basically the client's business metaphor is rubbish and doesn't work. If we just change it, do we get a better strategy? Do they get a better business? Now, there's a number of things to consider with this one. In levels 1, 2, 3 of the metaphors of movement model, one of the predominant principles is we don't change the metaphor. We're working with changing the person's strategy and behavior within their metaphorical world and how they deal with that. To merely change the metaphor is to merely create a denial. And there's enough of that going on already with how people cope with life. You know, the denial's going around, the shutters come down, we shut things out, don't think about it. Utilising the cognitive dissonance that then arises to deal with life. Largely, the metaphors of movement model at those first 3 levels is connecting people to the truth of their life, the truth of their identity. That's largely what we're doing. Now, in the business metaphors work, we're deviating because we're no longer working with experiential metaphor that's a representation of the person's experience. We're now dealing with their representation of the business. And you have to bear in mind that the metaphor and reality have this kind of weird recursion in that my metaphor is a map of reality, which in turn is shaped and organized by my experience of reality, which shapes and organizes my experience of my metaphor, and my metaphor shapes, and it just goes on and on and on, like holding 2 mirrors up to each other. Now, with business metaphors, this is not necessarily about our experience. So it's shaped around my understandings, what I do, the sort of operating principles that I have, my meta programs, all those kind of things are all coalescing together to give rise to this business metaphor. Now, the question I have is, immediately I would be thinking, if this person's metaphor is rubbish, and clearly they're not very successful in what they're doing simply doesn't work, is it because they don't know what they're doing? Or is it because they have all the skills there, they've just put them together incorrectly? Some people are just useless, simply because they've never had the education, experience or training to be anything but within the context in which they're useless. So there may well be an educational problem that's going on. However, some people are highly intelligent, highly educated and trained with lots of experience, but the strategy they're using, which is emanating from their core metaphor stuff, is the wrong one for the context. So switching the metaphor can be useful because it can open up other possibilities for people. Sometimes it might well be that it's got nothing to do with the metaphor. The metaphor is a illustration of the limitations the person has in terms of their understanding, their abilities, their skill sets, and all those other things. There's certain things we have to also pay attention to. So a very common one, when I'm doing the level 2, and on that last afternoon I introduced the business metaphors, one of the most common ones that coaches or sort of starting out therapists will tend to have, it's a little plant growing, it's a seed, a little seedling, a little sapling, something that's growing, a singular entity in a little plant pot. They even hold it like this. They even do this lotus kind of hand thing. Now, they've got their hands full with this. They've got their hands full with a little seedling that's growing. Now, what are they doing whilst they wait for it to grow? Probably not very much. Now, the reality is that's not exactly the best metaphor, but it is a good representation of what they're doing. So changing the metaphor doesn't necessarily change what they're doing, because you see how that works, right? Because we can just imagine anything to be different than it actually is. It doesn't mean anything changes. People are forever making plans and telling us what they're going to do, but they never do it. A lot of people want things to change. They'll do anything to help things change for themselves, as long as they don't be the one who has to do it. It's that kind of stuff. But it's not an unreasonable thing that somebody who is just starting out and has no experience, they're just beginning that whole journey or whatever it is that's going on, it is just a little seedling that's growing and their hands are quite full. Because to those who are seasoned and in the field of business or whatever the field is, you know all those mistakes, you've done all those screw-ups, you've learned the lessons, you've made the money, you've done those things. They haven't done it yet. They're simply at the beginning of it all. So now we have to look at, is that an unreasonable metaphor that requires or needs to be changed to something that's way more productive? Or do we work with the metaphor that is on offer? So for example, what I could ask them is, so what are you doing whilst your hands are full here with this little plant that's growing? What else do you need to get to grips with? Could you put that down for a period of time? Those kind of things. So we start to expand it. The stuff that's taught on level 2 on that last day, where we just start asking questions and making points relative to the person's metaphor, regardless of the value of the question or the point that we're raising, their value to ourselves. We're just trying to expand the person's thinking and reasoning into areas they may not have considered. So ultimately, we may want to start looking at a better business metaphor the person can have or the organization can have. It may well be we need to work with them at the experiential metaphor level, because it might be the skill set and how they're perceiving things that need to be adjusted. It might be nothing more than the person needs to be left alone or needs to be given training-based input rather than sort of therapeutic change work type input. It's important to remember the differentiation between what is a training need and what is a therapy need. There are way too many people undergoing training when they should be in therapy, and there are far more numbers of people in therapy when actually they require education and training. But my observation is that this is something that coaches, therapists, NLP practitioners, alphabet therapists across the board are very poor at differentiating between the two. So quite often you'll have a client who has a combination of educational needs, whether it's psychoeducation, thinking, teaching them thinking processes, whether it's social education, whether it's a training thing, so they have to be given the skill set to deal with problems that they've got, and how many of those things are actually therapeutic, where they need to have a coming to terms with a resolution of a feeling better about those kind of things. And most clients presenting to therapy will actually have a combination of those things. It's very important to have a differentiation between the two. If you've not thought about that area, I'd recommend that it's something you start to consider. So that's all we got for that one. I've got another question I'll come to. Okay, so the next question is about when you're coaching somebody for business stuff and what you're doing is metaphors of movement-based work. What do you do with there's the business metaphors and there's all the personal stuff that comes up. How do you differentiate between the two of those? And where do you begin? Which bit do you work with? Now, the typical way that I'll do this, and I do believe on the businessmetaphors.com website, there's a couple of examples on there. If there isn't yet, I'm trying to think now, I'll put some on there. I'll get some recorded and put on. Typically, any metaphor session that I run, the first thing I ask is pretty much the standard, which is the whole thing, the reason we're having this conversation, the reason that you're here, tell me what it's like. And then basically see what emerges from that. Now, some people who have experienced they're familiar with me, they're familiar with my work, they're familiar with metaphors, they'll go straight to thinking in metaphor. But people who are naive to my work, who've not experienced this stuff before, they will typically go to the classic, let me tell you the story of what's wrong. Now I may well interrupt that. I may let that run on because they'll give me idioms and stuff in that dialogue. So the trick here is to not worry so much in the early stage to differentiate. The main reason I do this is because getting people into metaphor can be challenging at times, and the easiest way to get people into metaphor is to chunk up and generalize. So I talk in big generalizations. I overgeneralize a lot. Easiest way to do that is with being opinionated, a little bit bombastic can be quite useful, but also by asking big, broad questions. What's the whole thing like, as opposed to tell me more about this specific individual thing? Because chunking down tends to be much more left brain activity. Chunking up becomes a much more right brain activity. So therefore it's more congruent to the metaphorical representations. So that's the typical opening thing. Now, what I'm going to be listening for, of course, is do they have personal limitations? So are we going to be finding obstructions, containers, all that kind of stuff within that experience? They will give us more than one metaphor, classically, if we know what we're listening for. But at some point during the session, I might then say, okay, so this business of yours, tell me what that's like. And of course, what I'm doing is now listening for, are they telling me how they feel about it? So that's a meta position to the business. Are they telling me how the business makes them feel? That's the consequences, that's the cause and effect. Are they telling me the representation of the business itself as they experience it to be, or how they have designed the business to be, as opposed to how it really is? They might give you metaphor how it really is, or just how they like to tell the story. Because remember, the story that people tell may sound metaphorical, but it may not be the thing itself. Now, how do you know the difference between any of these things? If I look back to the early days when I was doing this, I didn't. And very clearly I didn't, because on the Metaphors in My Attic program, there's a client session that's on there, which is, I've left it on there because it's quite cringeworthy now to look at it. At the time, I was full of confidence. I knew what I was doing. I was there, I'm in the zone, I'm there, I know what I'm doing. And it appears to be a good session. The client seems to be enjoying it. I'm clearly enjoying it, as I was. After the session, once the session had ended and the client stood up to leave, it became very, very clear that now something else is happening, and I couldn't quite work it out. The client made a comment to me as they left the room, and then as they were leaving, made another comment to somebody else who was also in the building. And I thought, that doesn't sound positive. The way that person is talking is not a positive experience. Later on, they wrote me an email, which again wasn't overly positive, and it certainly wasn't glowing. My memory of the experience was, it was a fantastic session. Now, knowing what I know now, looking at the session, looking at the video, it's cringeworthy, because I'm not differentiating between what is figures of speech. I'm not differentiating between the story that she's learned to tell and the experience that she has. And I'm treating them all as equal. I'm missing every single boundary violation that is presented. I didn't know boundary violations back then. So essentially what I thought I was doing was not what I was doing. That's a very, very common experience for anyone doing anything, especially in business. What they think they're doing versus what they say they're doing versus what they're actually doing don't necessarily line up. And this was one of the primary things in Bandler and Grinder's original NLP developments. They had differentiated that there was a difference between what therapists said they were doing and what therapists were actually doing. And they were paying much more attention to what they were actually doing rather than the theory of what they said. And that was one of the early influences in the NLP developments. I'd missed that. I missed that whole thing out. So when working with business clients, this is one of the areas you need to pay attention to. Now, the question for me then would come up, okay, what are the differences between those? At this stage, I'm not able to give you sets of criteria for how to measure the difference. There's some linguistic giveaways, whether they're using the I, you pronoun, whether they're using associated language or dissociated language. There's that kind of stuff. The gestures. I get the whole picture, but I haven't yet broken it down to a set of criteria. And I think there's a whole body of work potentially in this that people could actually start looking at. With experience, it becomes easier, but it's one of those things, I know it, but I don't know how I know it, if that makes sense. So at some point, I may well also ask, how do you feel about this business? And we could even start to do this. Elicit the business metaphor. So that's how the business is. How do you feel the business to be? Do they line up? So are they kinesthetically aligned with how the business is? If it isn't, how do they represent it? How do they feel about it? So we could go into their own personal stuff. We could also then, what is that like? And how do you feel about the business being that metaphor? Okay, so it's not how do you feel about the business, how do you feel about the metaphor you have for your business? So now we can go to a metaphor about their metaphor. Starts to sound a lot more complicated than it is. Essentially do this, elicit the business metaphor and go, how do you feel about that metaphor? Is that any good to you? Does that work? Now they go, I really like that metaphor, but clearly the metaphor is a dinosaur, for example. My favourite one in a workshop was the chap his business was a mammoth that's steering over the cliff. I think it's still one of the best examples of a business metaphor. And this was in an experimental workshop where I did not know what I was doing. I was just eliciting stuff, seeing what came up. What could I learn from this? What could people in the room teach me? And essentially, the guy was on a mammoth and it was going off the cliff and he's trying to steer it back again. Well, I think I fed back something along the lines of, well, this business of yours is a bit primitive, isn't it? And not only that, it's going over and it's going to take you down with it. It's basically destined for extinction very, very soon. Or I could even say its extinction is overdue, but I don't think I actually said that. So whilst it might well be he wasn't happy with that, of course, but imagine he was. Imagine for him, he's more than satisfied with his great big woolly mammoth metaphor and thinks that's fantastic. He's just got to get it steered in the right direction. Then we have to now think about this one. So are there alignments that we need to look at between how he feels about the metaphor? We can then ask that feeling, what's that like? And the metaphor itself. And is there something else in that relationship that we need to be addressing? I don't have any specific examples I can think of at this moment in time, but as they arise, I'm sure I'll remember this conversation hopefully as they arise, and I can draw back to it, go back to this. So I think that's what I got on that particular question. Now, I want to do a lot more of these. So if you have any metaphors questions about the metaphors of business or the level 1 and 2 of metaphors of movement, do please either leave it in the comment section below or send me an email, ask me on Facebook, and I will put it into the next video.